Hi everyone. I hope that you are doing okay. I say it every week, given the circumstances. I just want to kind of reiterate to everyone right now that I've found myself saying this, is there really is no way you should be feeling. Um, no one knows how to be feeling. It was abrupt. It is abrupt. It was sudden. It interrupted your life. It interrupted your daily routine. There are a lot of different things that you will be feeling. Mourning, loss of routine, loss of things in your life, scared, anxious, all of these emotions, and all of them are fine to be feeling. There's no way you should be feeling. And so, just realize that. I realize it's been several weeks now, so maybe there's some kind of routine, but it's the nature of this thing that uncertainty is the name of the game. But if you do need to talk to anyone, please don't forget that I am. You can email me, or we can do a Zoom meeting or anything like that. In regards to the class this week, I just want to say something. So there is a discussion post and analysis due for those of you in group two. If you don't end up meeting the deadline, I will extend it. Um, there is one final analysis and discussion for next week. We move into reading Immanuel Kant. The reading on Kant next week will be somewhat difficult, but that is the last group analysis and discussion that will be due, and that is next week. Um, there's a quiz on the reading tonight, and that will be available until noon tomorrow. And again, if that ends up needing to be extended for you, I have no problem doing that. Um, so there is, again, just as a reminder, the one big thing in this class now is the second paper. That is due Sunday, April 26th. I did amend the page requirement for 1 to 3 pages. I posted those prompts, I think, last week. The prompts are much shorter than the first paper, but please take a look at those. I have for everyone that submitted a first paper, I did grade those papers. You can revise and resubmit those papers. I realize you may not want to, and you may not have the energy to, given all the circumstances. But please be aware you do have the option to revise and resubmit. I downloaded all your papers, made comments in them, and gave you a grade. You can revise and resubmit them. There is an assignment that's been created for that. So if you have any questions about how that works, let me know. Moving then into this week's readings, I'm going to focus on just a few things. I want to focus. You already have some good context in place for David Hume, given last week's reading, and I want to say a little bit about some more things coming from Hume in this week's readings. In particular, what we get more of from Hume. You may be wondering, more what is Hume's positive philosophy, and he does have a positive philosophy, but a lot of Hume's philosophy is also critical, skeptical of previous philosophy. Hume is kind of like um, the 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 skeptic of the modern period, not a skeptic in the same sense as Descartes, but like the skeptic who simply demands that philosophers be coherent and consistent in their accounts, that they define their terminology, and that their arguments make sense. In particular, when it comes to metaphysical claims about things like causation, things like substance, things like claims about what a self is. So Hume is kind of not. I don't want to. He's not merely an attack dog. His skepticism serves a vital function in that it forces philosophers to be clear about the terms they're using. So what you get in today's reading, the Treatise of Human Nature, is another um, similar to the way that he looked at what he says. We have these notions of cause and effect. We talk about things like cause and effect, but he wants to say, what do we actually mean when we use language to describe the world and we say cause and effect? What are we saying? Are we talking about phenomena happening independently of us, or are we projecting our expectations onto the world? And that is a really crucial, distinction to make. And so Hume is again considered an empiricist, and indeed his empiricist principle kind of comes to the forefront in today's reading. Hume's empiricist principle is simply that every idea that we have must have arisen from a preceding impression. So it's referred to by scholars as the copy principle. Every idea must have a preceding impression. So in today's reading on page 517, I have the book here in front of me. Hume says, as every idea is derived from a precedent impression, had we had any idea of the substance of our mind, we must also have an impression of it, which is very difficult, if not impossible, to be conceived. So that's what he is sort of dealing with at the beginning of today's reading. He's looking at philosophers who have talked about substance, not only the substance or the idea we have of ourselves as a mental substance, as a thinking thing, as Descartes would have referred to us, but also claims about substance out in the world, extended substance. So how can we make sense of this term? Philosophers have used the term substance, but have they ever clarified satisfactorily what the meaning of substance is, such that we have some kind of clarity about it? And it's the prominence of this term throughout all of the modern period, the focus on substance, that has caused a lot of confusion and philosophical problems that Hume feels needs to be kind of, before we can make any progress, we must clarify the meaning of this term. So on 517, a little above that, Hume says, these philosophers are the curious reasoners concerning the material or immaterial substances in which they suppose our perceptions to inhere. In order to put a stop to these endless cavils on both sides, I know no better method than to ask these philosophers in a few words what they mean by substance and inhesion. And after they have answered these questions, it will then be reasonable, and not until then, to enter seriously into the dispute. So define your terms. Tell me what you mean before we can have any serious philosophical conversations. So again, what you see from Hume is kind of circumscribing what can and cannot be discussed as a serious matter in philosophy. And for Hume, metaphysics, metaphysical claims, metaphysical speculation largely falls outside the bounds of doing philosophy. So anyways, I want to think then about what is the meaning of substance. So I'm going to refer to one set of notes that I have here. These are just notes titled Hume 1. And so to read here just a little bit of a beginning, the author, once again referring to Hume, once again deploys his principle that every idea is a copy of some preceding impression. So if we have an idea of mental substance, we must have had an impression of it. But this poses a difficult, if not impossible, problem. 1. If an impression of substance represents it, presumably it would have to resemble the substance. But by hypothesis, an impression is a perception that depends on or inheres in a substance. Since it is not a substance and has none of the particular qualities or characteristics of a substance, how could it represent a substance by resembling it? So then he says, again, the author challenges anyone claiming that we have an idea of mental substance to point out the impression that gives rise to it, explain how the impression operates, and show its origin. So at the end of the day, Hume's large claim about substance is that we have no impression of it. There is no impression that has given rise to our idea of substance, and therefore, according to this empiricist principle, we cannot consistently claim to have an idea of substance. And so again, he continues to go on here. So Spinoza and Descartes have both defined substance as, quote, something which may exist by itself. So you remember Spinoza saying his definition of substance is that which is conceived through itself and that which exists in itself, which was largely derived from a similar definition that Descartes had given. And so the idea is that somehow that a substance is something that can be clearly and distinctly perceived. And that somehow this substance is, again, something which may exist by itself. It exists on its own. We can conceive of it independently from other things, and therefore that's what makes a substance a substance. It is the sort of primary concept needed for us to make sense of metaphysics, because if we're going to talk about metaphysics, we're going to be talking about beings, and beings are things which are capable of independent existence. Well, so then Hume goes on to say, but what about a perception itself? Can't we define a perception itself, something that can be clearly and distinctly perceived? Can't the definition that they've given of substance also apply to a perception itself? So because, again, I can think about one thought independently from another thought. And so therefore, if I can conceive of this thought independently from this thought, then wouldn't it follow that a perception that I can clearly and distinctly perceive is itself a substance? But that doesn't make a sense. That doesn't make a sense. Exactly. That's exactly. And so in that case, so according to that definition, perception itself is a substance. The consequence that perception is a substance completely undermines the distinction between perception as an accident of a substance in which it inheres, right? So the idea is that thoughts themselves are modes of substance, right? That we have, so going back to the definition that Descartes and Spinoza had provided, that there are modes of substance itself, and those modes are individual thoughts. But now, if according to the definition, substance is something that may exist by itself, and a perception is something that can exist by itself, then it can no longer be considered as a mode that inheres in some larger substance, because now we've been able to say that a perception can exist on its own. And so that already kind of undermines the definition that is being given of substance here, because it's not possible to think about how a thought, which is capable of existing by itself, can be called a substance. So there's an inconsistency here. Now, I want to continue looking at another, there's a rather large, I wouldn't say large, but somewhat of a digression beginning on page 518, right? 518. So Hume is thinking about how it is that thoughts can be about something. So this really, Hume's discussion from 517 over to, well, really over to section 6, where the discussion of personal identity starts on 525. Hume is considering how it is that thought and extension kind of link up. So it's similar discussion that the rationalists who we thought about earlier this semester were engaged in. But the question is about how it is that mental substance can be about extended substance, even though Hume is not using that terminology. Just as a point of reference, how is it that mental phenomena and physical phenomena interact? How do they interact with one another, right? So for example, at the top of page 518, when Hume says, it is impossible that anything divisible, which is supposed to be extended substance here, it is impossible that anything divisible can be conjoined to a thought or perception, which is a being altogether inseparable and indivisible. So he goes on here to ask some, sort of humorous questions, but he says, supposing such a conjunction, and that is to say, supposing that we can assume that something like extension and thought can be conjoined together, would the indivisible thought exist on the left or on the right hand of this extended divisible body, on the surface or in the middle, on the back or foreside. If it is conjoined with the extension, it must exist somewhere within its dimensions. If it exists within its dimensions, either it must exist in one particular part, and then the particular part is indivisible, and the perception is conjoined only with it, not with. Um, thought. So at the end of the paragraph, he says, thought, therefore, and extensions are qualities wholly incompatible and can never incorporate together into one subject. So Hume is reflecting here about how it is that thoughts can be about physical objects. When I say I think about this phone, when I'm thinking about it, when I'm having a thought about a physical object, Hume says, well, where is the thought located, or something like that. I mean, I think he's also thinking about, you know, extended substance and thinking substance in terms of the mind and the body, and where, when I think in up here, where would my thought be located within my body itself? So he's posing that question, but he's also posing the question is, how is it that I think about things that are wholly unlike me? The mental and the physical are so unlike one another in terms of divisibility and indivisibility that it doesn't seem possible for my thought to be about something that is unlike my thought. They are different in kind, such that trying to figure out how one can be about the other, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, Hume will continue into a rather lengthy discussion between thinking about how it is that we form particular kinds of ideas, especially as it relates to the senses and certain qualities, and how it is that we can locate certain kinds of sensorial qualities, where it is that we locate them in our mind, and how we make sense of the interaction between our senses and the physical objects, and how the physical objects themselves can somehow give rise to these senses, these sensorial qualities and things like that. And I'm not going to say a lot more about that today, but that's largely taking place again on pages 519 and continuing over onto page 520. It's him thinking about how it is that thinking and extension interact with one another, how extension can give rise to thoughts. How can something like an extended object give rise to thoughts? And largely, Hume is going to fall back on his empiricism here to talk about, causation and contiguity and resemblance and associations of ideas, or what's actually going on when we have the idea of certain qualities and certain impressions. They arise from the associations of our ideas. That's his empiricism kind of coming through. But the idea that there's some kind of quality in an object that gives rise to a quality in us, or an idea in us, is something that he doesn't think there's evidence for, and so he just goes back to his empiricism. But what I want to focus on more is thinking about what Hume says about personal identity. In particular, what is a self? Hume has a very famous definition of the self, and he calls it a bundle of perceptions. That, I think it's important to say, when we talk about a self implies something that is unitary, something that endures kind of across time, that self implies a kind of identity, that the thing remains to some extent the same thing that it is across time. Remember, this concept of personal identity came up in Locke. A lot of you answered midterm questions about this, about how it is that we make sense of the self, and Locke had discussed it in terms of a continuity of consciousness, knowing that a set of thoughts or memories about my past, even though I may now have different preferences and different likes and dislikes, nonetheless, I still remember that I once did have a different set of them, and that remembering of myself when I was younger, even though I now no longer have those memories belong to me, and I can remember them, and there's a continuity across my experiences, that I can remember them all as belonging to me, and therefore that's a sense in which I am the same person and the same self, and that's there's a kind of continuity there. But seeing what Hume says here on 525, there are some philosophers who imagine we are every moment intimately conscious of what we call ourself, that we feel its existence and its continuous existence, and are certain beyond the evidence of a demonstration of both its perfect identity and its simplicity. The strongest sensation, the most violent passion, they say, instead of distracting us from this view, only fix it the more intensely and make us consider their influence on self. So, Hume will go on here to ask on 526. He says, unluckily, all these positive assertions are contrary to that very experience which is pleaded for them, nor have we any idea of self after the manner it is explained. For from what impression could this idea be derived? So again, you see Hume seemingly coming back to the idea that, oh, that's a poor choice of words, but the principle, the empiricist principle, that for any idea we claim to have, we must be able to point to the impression that gave rise to it. And when we say, I have an idea of myself, just take that as an utterly banal statement that you talk about yourself. I have an idea of myself. Just take that statement. What does it mean? What is the idea of the self? Can you point in experience to the impression that gave rise to this identical thing that you call the self? Hume is going to just ask you to reflect on that empirically and say, what impression gave rise to the idea you have of yourself? And he thinks you're going to be hard-pressed to point to one impression that gave rise to this particular idea or concept you have of a self. So he's interrogating what you mean, not only what philosophers mean, but what you mean when you say you have an idea of a self. What is it? What does it mean? And that's what he's trying to get at here. So I'm looking here again at the notes that I have uploaded titled Hume Notes 2. And the idea is, so I'm looking at, when I go down, and I say, well, but quote, the self or person is not any one impression, but that to which our several impressions and ideas are supposed to have a reference. So the ideas and impressions that we have at any given particular moment are supposed to, the reason is that they belong to me as the person having the thoughts. So there is a thinker and the thoughts. Remember, that's Descartes' revelation. As I think, therefore I am. And the idea is that Descartes, at one point in the Meditations, he says, thought exists. That is my discovery. He announces that at the beginning of meditation too. Thought exists. And Descartes' presupposition is that for thought to exist, there must be somebody having the thoughts. That's how he is able to say that he is, but that even if the demon is deceiving him, thought exists. Thought exists, and then he goes on to discover that he is a thinking thing. There must be a subject who is being deceived. Thought is not just free floating out in the universe, but thought must be contained within a subject. And so that is what, so when he says ideas supposed to have a reference, the requisite impression would have to continue invariably the same, given the idea of self as perfectly identical. But then he goes on to say, and I'm reading here again from the notes on page 1 of the notes, Hume Notes 2. There is no impression constant and variable. All our sensations and passions come and go in succession, and they generally do not exist at the same time. So no one of these, no pain, joy, could be the impression that gives rise to the idea of themselves. Since these are all impressions, we have no such idea. So there is no one impression. There's just a bunch of perceptions and ideas and impressions all the time going on. It's a flux. And that, there are a bunch of particular perceptions, but none of them we kind of pick out and say, aha, that's the one that gives rise to the self, right? And that's Hume's, again, this is Hume's empiricism here. He's just kind of actively reflecting upon what it's like to engage in mental experience. What is mental experience? And where in mental experience, mental introspection, do we get an independent idea of a self? Hume wants to say the only thing we get is mental experience is a flux of perceptions. Of course, we can stop and reflect on any one particular impression at one time or another, but that it's the activity itself. There's not some separate thinker who does the activity. That's it's one and the same. Thought and perception is the self. It is a continuous stream of activity. So the bundle of perceptions is the self. That's how he defines it. So on page 526 in the reading, on the when he's 526 in the second column, he says, setting aside some metaphysicians of this kind, I may venture to affirm of the rest of mankind that they are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in perpetual flux and movements. Our eyes cannot turn in their sockets without varying our perceptions. Our thought is more variable than our sight, and all our other senses and faculties contribute to this change. The mind is a kind of theater where several perceptions successively make their appearance, pass, repass, glide away, and mingle an infinite variety of postures and situations. There is properly no simplicity in it at one time, nor identity indifferent, right? So that's, again, it's a bizarre kind of reflection here, but the self, when we say the self is perception. That's what the self is. The self is the flux of perception at any given moment. There is no substance apart from the thought. It's thought and perception. That's it. And it's what we intuit from thought, that we make a leap and a jump from the succession of perceptions, and we think that somehow that gives rise to this independent self. And that's the mistake that Hume thinks we make, and I want to talk about that in a moment. So where does the mistake come from? Where do we go wrong in thinking, for Hume, that there is an independent self or thinker that somehow exists apart from the flux of perception? And Hume points it out in terms of two different kinds of ideas. So I'm looking here at the notes, and it's not easy to get at what Hume is describing here because it is a little bit abstract. But I want to look, he begins talking about this on page 527 at the top. He's going to talk about how it is that we end up conflating or confusing two different ideas. And these two different ideas are going to be identity and relation. So let's look at what then gives rise to so great a propensity to describe an identity to the successive perception, and to suppose ourselves possessed of an invariable and uninterrupted existence through the whole course of life. So what Hume is getting at here is that at any moment, all we have access to are a flux of perceptions, of individual thoughts. And what we end up doing when we sort of reflect on and introspect about these successive perceptions, yes, they belong, there is a kind of succession that one leads to the other. That I think of a phone, and I think of its color, and I think of its color. So there is a natural association and succession of different ideas that belong together. It's from the succession that we assume that the thoughts inherently belong to each other, that there is some kind of necessary connection between the thoughts, that the thoughts cause each other. And it's from the succession that we mistakenly infer a kind of identity. And it's and that's where he thinks we make the mistake. It's inevitable that we do this. But Hume is kind of phenomenologic. He's engaged in some phenomenology here about what's going on when we engage in this. And he says Hume. So I'm in the notes here. Hume begins by describing two relations that are in themselves perfectly distinct and even contrary. The first is the identity of the relation or sameness, is that of objects existing in an invariable and interrupted way over a period of time. And then two, the idea of the relation of diversity, is that of more than one distinct object existing at successive times, though connected together by a close relation. These two ideas are said to be distinct in the sense that we can distinguish them from other. Despite the contrariness of these two ideas, we confuse them routinely in our common thinking. So again, what he's saying here is the idea of the relation of diversity is that of more than one distinct object existing at successive times, though connected together, and the idea of identity or sameness. So we confound identity with relation. That's what we do. That relation between thoughts we assume is an identity between thoughts, that the thoughts are essentially the same, overlapping, when in fact there is still this stream between them, that they are individual thoughts. They are related, they do succeed one another, but they are not, as a result of the succession of individual thoughts, somehow the same thought, the same continuous thought. They're still individual thoughts, succeeding one another, related to one another, but they are not, as a result of being related to one another, the same thought. They are still individual thoughts with a succession and relation, but not of an identity. And again, this Hume's discussion here is really fascinating. So this he continues in this to the end of today's reading. This idea of mistaking the relation of or mistaking the idea of relation for identity, of